We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Welcome to Finances, your home for all things financial, investment, money and lifestyle. Hosted and curated by the very talented team of certified financial planners, Burke Financial Partners. The guest today is Stefan Manche, Principal Law and Head of Wills and Estate and Succession Planning at Coulter Legal. Stefan, thanks for coming and have a chat with me today.
No worries. Great to be here today.
Now, we had coffee, when was it? A couple of weeks ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was amazing talking to you about the evolution of your role and also your current role, just how many similarities there are between the estate planning world and the financial planning world. So I thought, hey, let's get on the podcast and let's introduce you to the finances listeners, but also anyone out there that doesn't know who you are. It's a good opportunity to get to know you. So the way our format generally works is we try to get to know a little bit about you before we start talking all things estate planning. We keep that to a minimum. So before we hit record, you were just talking, Peter was in here before, and we were just talking about your heritage being Maltese, and we're talking about the Northern Hemisphere summer being pretty hot at the moment, and your parents, as I understand it, migrated out from Malta. When did they come out?
Late 70s.
Okay.
Yep.
So that kind of wasn't post-World War II, or was it their parents?
Yeah, so their parents, World War II, but stayed in Malta.
Yep.
And then my parents followed their siblings, a couple of their siblings out to Australia. So my mum had two brothers who landed in Altona and Geelong, and she and my dad got married in they were 20 and 21, got married in Malta, headed straight across to Australia, and so they're on their 40-odd year or 45-odd year, wedding celebration still.
So what was the draw to Australia from Malta at that point? So in the 70s, obviously it's a few years after the end of World War II.
Yeah.
I think Malta was a fairly significant staging point for the Allies and got hammered there.
Yes.
But why in 1970, after the war had resolved, did they move?
Just opportunities. I think they saw, it's wild even just a generation or two back, but my uncle, who was 18, moved here to follow his family. His girlfriend, who was 14 at the time, moved across to follow, love, 18-year-old love, as you do, and, started a life here. My mum, was really, really close with her siblings. She was the youngest of 5, and hearing about Australia and the opportunities for work and education, they were planning a family already. So that was the draw. And it seems like, Malta is such a small country, although, a really interesting melting pot of culture. But it's a 350, 400,000 population. And it feels like I've been once, it still feels small. It feels bigger post them joining the EU, but small. And so that the opportunity to move, at the time, Maltese people were either moving to Italy, to Australia or to Canada. And that seems to have been pretty consistent for a long period of time, and very specific pockets of those countries. And so they were part of that move, and both didn't go back for about 25 years each. So really sort of committed to Australia.
So the Maltese English is spoken predominantly in Malta, as well as Italian to a large degree, and Maltese.
Yep.
So when your parents came out, they were fluent in English, so yes. I'm assuming, yes.
Yep. Accent aside, which, late 70s created some difficulties, they stood out. And even us as kids, in primary school, I had a hell of an accent, even though they didn't teach us Maltese. They said, we're here in Australia, it's English, you're learning English, which is quite different to a lot of Maltese migrants who spoke Maltese in the home. And they tended to, like a lot of migrants, kind of congregate in societies of Maltese, groups of Maltese people.
So where did the Maltese congregate? I think you grew up in Werribee, is that right?
Yeah. So they started life living in Altona. Werribee was a country town at that stage, and so they moved to Werribee for their country town life, which is driving through there now is wild to think about. Yeah, so they settled in Werribee. There's a bit of a Maltese community in Werribee, but they tended to settle. Altona was popular. Parkville, like that side, St Albans, that side of Melbourne, western suburbs was pretty popular with the Maltese then. So
how old were your parents when they arrived?
20 and 21.
Okay.
Yep.
And what designs did they have on employment or opportunities? What were they thinking? What did they do in Malta, and then what were they thinking they'd do when they landed?
So both worked in the bank. So they got jobs in the city in Melbourne working in banks. Dad did night school for I think 5 or 6 years and got his accounting qualifications, became an accountant.
Okay.
And did that, ended up doing that for the majority of his career, and went from sort of big practices, late 90s, early 2000s, moved more into the kind of, he was looking at the forefront of the IT space, but with accounting software, and continued that through his career. Mum worked in the bank for a while, and then once they were ready to have kids, once they were settled for a few years, stopped work. So that was, and that was pretty traditional, I guess. I'm one of 4 kids, so she certainly had her hands full with all of us. And so, but the idea was to settle here to give, they had more opportunity, but to provide opportunity for us as their kids growing up. So as you can imagine, that was very much bricks and mortar, like get a home, get an education, get a profession.
Kids only arrived once they had arrived in Australia?
Yep. So we started to arrive once they'd been in Australia 4 or 5 years.
So where are you in the order of your...
So I'm second out of 4. So I've got an older sister. There's me. I've got a brother, a younger brother and a younger sister.
Yeah.
So 2 boys, 2 girls. We're all roughly 2.5 years apart.
Yep.
So yeah.
Well planned distances.
Yes.
So what was life like growing up to Maltese parents in Altona and Werribee for you?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, Werribee's always been pretty multicultural, even back then. It's certainly grown in that dimension since, but always pretty multicultural. But there was always differences. Like I remember little things like seeing all of the kids eating Vegemite and thinking,
what's that?
What is that? And I remember begging my mum for like weeks to get us Vegemite, only for her to like spread it on bread like Nutella.
Yeah, no, that's wrong, Mum.
Yeah, and take, this like long-awaited bite at lunchtime and thinking, what are these kids eating? Like, what is this? And then all conversely being the kid with the like smelly lunchbox. With,
so what is the Maltese lunch of choice?
Yeah, so it's very Mediterranean diet, although it's pretty heavily like British influenced as well. So a real interesting mix, but, it would, tuna and bread rubbed with tomatoes and olive oil and or hard-boiled eggs and, so classic Mediterranean, which, nowadays is gourmet.
Yeah.
But
kids back then with
in
their,
the 80s,
they've got their peanut butter sandwich thinking, what's this guy? What's this kid doing with his eggs in his lunchbox?
Yep. But yeah, we always really close-knit family. Education was always really sort of pushed, but also we did, the arts was really pushed as well. So, and again, really off the back of the opportunities that my parents didn't have themselves as young kids. So I played guitar from when I was about 4 years old. My brother played piano. My sisters danced and did gymnastics and all sorts of stuff. I think like any kid, you always want the opposite of what you're encouraged into. So I was always wanted to do sport and sort of then dove into that as a older teenager with soccer and footy and whatever I could get my hands on. But yeah, it was I think, pretty normal for migrant children, suburban upbringing, basically. Yeah.
Now, you ended up, did you go to primary school in Werribee or Altona?
Werribee, yep.
And then for secondary school, you did the trip down to Geelong, to St. Joey's.
Yep.
What drove that?
Yeah, so we grew up Catholic, as most Maltese people are. And so when my older sister was about to start high school, they were opening a new Catholic secondary school in Werribee, which is Thomas Carr. It's been there for ages now. But that was going to be a really slow build, and they weren't offering a lot of extracurricular stuff early on and sort of doing that, start with year 7, then add year 8, year by year. And my older sister was really heavily into dance and the arts at that stage, so wasn't quite going to offer what she wanted. And they'd zoned Werribee, so they said half, to fill up this new school, half this, if you're going to go to a Catholic school in Werribee, you've got to go to Thomas Carr if you're in this zone. And we were in that zone. So Mum and Dad started looking elsewhere. And so Sacred Heart was recommended. Yep. And so my older sister ended up there. And so we kind of followed along then at Joey's, which meant hour and a bit on the bus each way.
I was going to say, I'm assuming Mum and Dad weren't driving you to school.
No, so there was a lot of time on the bus, which in hindsight, made after-school activities pretty hard. I think we were talking I'm so stoked our kids go to school close to home. And, it's such a gift when we're walking home and they've got a mate with them walking and they just work out between them that one of them's going to come over or our little one's going to go over to their place, and it's easy. Like, it's so easy. I remember the logistics of trying to even just arrange a play at someone's place after school, or, you know, doing soccer after school, you know, training, that sort of thing. So ended up at Joey's.
So did you travel down the entire time? Did your parents stay in Werribee?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so that was home. And I guess when I started, I still had younger siblings at primary school in Werribee. But my brother ended up at Joey's. Then my younger sister ended up at Sacred Heart as well. So we all ended up down that way. Yeah, so it became normal for us. But it certainly was like most kids in a new school, it was challenging going into a school where the majority of people had mates from primary school already had communities and networks. So I was kind of building that again was the challenge. But through that, I fell in love with Geelong. So I ended up at Deakin at Warm Ponds for uni. I did some stints in Melbourne, but met my wife and we...
Did you live on res in Geelong?
No, did the commute. So
okay.
I did some Ks in those first few years.
I bet you did.
So I was going, mum and dad were, again, with migrant parents, it wasn't you're 18, you move out. It was you stay at home as long as you can and you move out when you can buy a house like that, or you finish your studies. That's, you focus on your studies. My dad was he didn't want me to have a HECS debt. So I worked 3 jobs while I was at uni so I could pay my uni up front.
Including your guitar lessons.
Including my guitar lessons.
Yeah.
And
so that legitimately paid for all of...
Wow. Yeah. Because back then you got a 25% discount if you paid up front, your fees. It was still a lot doing law commerce, but managed to get through that way. But yeah, I was commuting from Werribee to Warm Ponds for uni. My girlfriend, who's now my wife, was living in Burwood. So I'd sort of touch down in Werribee, head up to Burwood to see her. So yeah, I did a lot of Ks that first couple of years. But, she'd grown up in Geelong, second half of her childhood in Geelong. And so that's where we ended up settling once we finished uni and, had done our stints in Melbourne. And yeah.
Can I backtrack just a little bit to try and connect the dots between, you end up doing... You said commerce law at Deakin.
Yep.
When did the idea of doing law or commerce or thinking about getting into the legal profession enter your mind? Was there a push from your dad to follow in the accounting path, or did you find your own path in that?
Yeah. So there was always a push for a profession. That was always a real push. The profession itself, I was always better at sort of English-based studies as opposed to maths. I was okay with maths, but that wasn't a strong point for me. And I think around year 10, I did legal studies and, 16-year-old me said, I'm pretty good at this.
I'm going to be a lawyer.
Yep. And so that was pretty much it.
There wasn't any other more significant moment than that?
Not really, no. So the combination
watch the Firm or one of those legal dramas and think that's me.
I mean, looking back on it, there's a big part of me that thought, also probably subconsciously thought my parents are going to be really happy if I end up a lawyer.
Yeah.
And they are, and they were. And, coming from English not being a first language base and having someone who's a lawyer that was a big deal for them, probably still is a big deal for them. But it's, just the combination of finding something that I felt like I was good at or better at than other things. I was better at it than science. So, that kind of ruled out the medicine route. Yeah, and numbers just didn't particularly excite me. So I thought I was always relatively good at writing and interpreting, and so that was the route. But I've always been a person who's really committed to what I start. But again, that was drilled into me by my parents.
It sounds as though it's probably the influence of your parents very much so.
If you start something, you commit to it and you finish it. That was just what I did with music. There was, with guitar, which I really appreciate now, but there was never you're not so into it now, we'll try something else. It was no, we've committed to this and you've put some time into it, let's stick with it. And so it was the same with uni. I think that was a 5-year course and there were times within it I thought, I'm not really sure if this is what I want to do. But I've committed and I'd put money up front, that probably got me through. Yeah, and so that was really the lead into the career.
So 5 years at Warm Ponds, where did you find yourself after those 5 years? And you'd met your girlfriend, now wife, during that time?
Yep.
So this has got to be late 90s, early 2000s, is that right?
Yeah. So I studied at Deakin I was 2005 to 09, I think, was when I did that course. In my last 2 years, so I'd done with the commerce, I had completed a few like clerkships in the kind of commerce space. So I did a clerkship at EY in Melbourne. I did one somewhere else as well. But I was always still heading towards the legal side of things. And so for the last 2 years of uni, I'd done a day a week internship at Howard Andrews in their Melbourne office. And then I ended up accepting my articles or the kind of graduate year at Howard Andrews. And that position was in Geelong. And so that worked well. My wife finished nursing at the same time. She ended up and is still at Bowen Health in Geelong. So Howard Andrews was the first. So, with those 2 years, I think the first 7 years of my legal career in Geelong.
I saw a couple of articles of you when you actually joined Howard Andrews. There was a couple of online articles, and you, like me, had a full rug of hair, mate, that seems to have moved from the top to the chin over the years. We've followed many similar paths, that being one of them as well. So when did you joined Howard Andrews and you did your your articles?
Yep. It's now called your legal graduate year, but articles as it was then. I really connected with a mentor I had there, Kim Henderson.
Oh, yeah.
Still around the traps in Geelong. But I then started my actual practicing career in family law. So I did my first 18 months in family law as a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, just out of uni with not a whole lot of life experience and coping mechanisms. That was really hard. And so I made a call about 18 months in that actually I don't think I can keep doing that.
Yeah.
And
so what was it specifically about family law that you felt you couldn't push on with?
Yeah, it was dealing with the parenting and the children issues.
Okay.
And having adults look at you for not only legal advice, but as counselling. Yep. And as a general being a lawyer didn't give you the tools to actually solve the problems, like the immediate problems that they had. So, I used to hate Friday afternoons because that was like handover for the weekend visit.
Yeah.
And there's rarely a Friday afternoon that didn't end up in some panicked call about, it hasn't happened, or ex-partners said they're not going to allow the kids to come over this weekend. And like people broken by that.
Yeah. Calling you thinking that you're going to be able to offer them some immediate solution.
Yeah, at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And I couldn't. But I also hadn't built the coping mechanisms to leave that at work at 5 o'clock on Friday and go home and be okay with it. So it was, I just found that really difficult.
It's funny, that commonality between a lot of the people that I've spoken to on this podcast about having empathy and needing to care for your clientele, but also at the same time not getting emotionally involved.
Yep.
It's such a balancing act because it's so, you're a counsellor, you're a professional, you're also a human. So you actually do feel people's challenges, and you can imagine them being your challenges. It's very hard sometimes to detach, but I think as a professional, I think that's one of our superpowers. Like if you can actually be detached from a situation and view it through unemotional eyes, it allows you to offer much greater perspective and support to people than if you do get emotionally attached. So I totally feel your pain from those early years.
Yeah, and I think I had that, I had one piece of that puzzle. So I had the empathy, and so people were calling on me and appreciated that, but I didn't have that ability to then, detach from it myself, which is a skill that's developed over time. I just didn't have it at that stage. So I said to the firm, I don't think I can do family law anymore. And so I was given the opportunity to move into wills and estates and haven't looked back. So it's over 10 or 11 years since that move, and that's all I've really focused on professionally.
Now, you've had a couple of other moves since then. So you were at Howard Andrews.
Yep.
In that 10-year period, you went from Howard Andrews, I think you moved back to Melbourne, is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Sort of, who was that with?
Russell Kennedy.
Yep.
So it's kind of bigger firm, mid-tier firm of about 300, but I was sitting in their estate planning succession team. So we did a lot of high net wealth estate planning and some higher profile sort of estate dispute work. So phenomenal experience, but I was commuting from Geelong with little ones, and that commute just killed me.
Okay, so we skipped a couple of things.
I skipped a few.
So by this time, you've moved from Werribee down to Geelong. You've had a couple of kids. Let's talk quickly about when you had the kids and when you moved to Geelong.
Yeah, so we moved to Geelong probably in the last year of uni. We were living in Geelong and then really settled. So we had a rental for that first year of working, saved a deposit, bought a little place in Little Avenue in
your dad would be happy.
Hamlin Heights. He was very happy, yes. And so
a degree and a house.
Yep. We just before the house, we got married. So we got married. 6 months later, we did the house.
Just got to tick off some kids and you're there.
Yep, yes. And so then when I look back, we didn't have any fixings on it being a really traditional path, but that's the way it turned out, as it did. Almost embarrassingly traditional. Yeah, so I got married, bought the house, and then a year later, which would probably be 2 or 3 years into the legal career full time, we had our first little one. So Ned, he's now 10 years old. We've got 2.5 years later, Audrey followed him. So Audrey is 7, almost 8 now. And then a few years later, we had Sid, who is 3.5. So we've got a full plate. So I think when I started working at Russell Kennedy, Audrey would have been only a year old, maybe, so 12 months. And, so I was doing the getting up, getting into the suit in complete darkness, not to wake anybody up.
How did you get to Melbourne? Oh, you were on the train.
On the train, yep. So probably on the train by 6 or 6:30 in the morning. So leaving in darkness, coming home in darkness, I was really rushing to try and get home to get the last little bit of the day with the kids, which at that age was, they're in bed at 7:30. So not much of the day left. And usually parents with kids at that age will understand or remember the worst part of the day, like the really tricky, getting them through dinner when they're already tired and bath and bed and, so not ideal, not the lifestyle we really wanted.
No. And when your kids are that old too, they're a pretty good reference point for how quickly time goes by because they change so quickly. Yep. One of the things I feel I've been very fortunate in that I've always lived in Geelong and close to work. So being able to be in and around the kids, I can't imagine. We've got another office in Shepparton, but I don't go there that often. But having to travel to Melbourne every day, I'm out, which is what you thought, I'm assuming, and you thought I got to find another gig back in Geelong.
Yep. Yeah, no, it was tricky. And I remember feeling, getting to the end of the week and spending the weekend, 100% with the kids. And, some weeks their entire routine had changed. Within a week, what I thought was nap times and meal times and bedtime had just changed completely. So I was really feeling like I was missing out, and that's not something I wanted. So then I got a tap on the shoulder from the crew at Canny Group.
Yep.
So that's a multidisciplinary practice. So it was accounting, financial advisory, and they were just building a legal team. And so I was brought on board to really help build that legal arm of the business. And so that was really interesting and exciting for me. I still was doing it legal work and still doing that estate planning, but I had to broaden my experience a little bit to meet what the existing client base needed. We had to build lawyers up for the team, build how we delivered the service and how we made that work alongside the other sort of arms of the business. So
it's pretty fresh and raw as a legal practice.
Yes. Yeah. Very, 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 very raw. And I learned so much in those, I think, 2.5 years that I was there. And I think we had some great successes. And that was, aside from that, a joy moving back to Geelong and working in a really family-focused business. And I learned most of what I know about operating a business, not just operating a law practice, but operating a business and what it takes to keep a business afloat and what it takes to make a business profitable. I learned so much, which I now feel I bring to my sort of everyday practice, which is fantastic. A lot of lawyers don't, you follow the traditional path, don't get that opportunity at that level of your career.
I was thinking about some of the things that you'd said in our conversation, having a coffee and even in the email that you sent through prior to us chatting, and your focus very much is you talk about team and service. Mm-hmm. It's a very non-traditional way, I'd say, of looking at an estate planning business or a role. And you're right, it's not really the way lawyers have probably thought about that in the past.
No.
And having a focus. So that a focus around team and service and operating in a contemporary manner, that kind of brings us up to date with you joining Coulter Legal. How long ago did you join them?
So I joined them May 2020, so mid-COVID. So I basically grabbed a laptop and went home for 6 months. That was really interesting because within that 6 months, I then took over as head of the Wills and Estates team. And hadn't met most of them in person at that stage. So it was a really interesting coming into a leadership role and having to build rapport with the team. Obviously had my own ideas about how I wanted to see the team run and was keen to kind of get them underway quickly. COVID also forced us to change a lot of how the team practiced. So we, introduced a remote signing. We introduced digital meetings. The office on Ryrie Street has this little turnaround underneath. So we ended up doing drive-through will signings.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, which was, and so for a team, the legal space is very traditional. It's slow moving. So we had to change all of that overnight. So
that contrast between establishing brand new practice at Canny Group and then coming to a very well established practice with Coulter Legal. I'm assuming there was some challenges. You brought plenty of the learnings from Canny Group to what is a fairly long-standing practice at Coulter. What were some of the main challenges when you came across and headed up that team?
So, a couple of the things were joining that team remotely. It was really hard to absorb how things operate. So what the processes were for day to day, how things were done, how people like to work. When we're all at home, aside from maybe one person in the office at a point in time, that was really, really tricky. Then there was the whole change management piece, which is that knowing we had to make a change. It wasn't even an optional change. It was, a lot of change is often seen as just one person's idea and, everyone else has to follow. This was we either do this or the team can't operate. Like we can't do the work we need to do.
It's kind of a good situation. Really.
Yeah, great.
It's that crisis creates opportunity.
Yeah, and it did. And it probably, fast forwarded us 50 years within a couple of weeks. And if we hadn't had that crisis situation, we probably wouldn't be where we are now.
That's amazing to think, isn't it? That you can get so, and we're the same, like you get very stuck in a way of doing things and you get in sort of a rut and a pattern of behaviour that you think, oh, well, it's kind of working. But it's not until you either are forced to, which COVID did for a lot of businesses, or you actually have the time to actually sit up and look around. I think we talked about that when we had a coffee, about the fact that one of the challenges in business and thinking about your estate team as a business is that sometimes you've actually got to stop and you've got to lift your eyes up and look at where are the opportunities and what does the sector and what do our clientele actually need and want. It probably brings us to the service and the point of difference. I think that's really a pretty interesting element of what you're doing at Coulter, about the point of difference you have in the way that you deliver service, the way you charge for service, and the service you actually offer. Do you want to maybe talk to that?
Yeah, sure. And I'm really, really proud of it. So I hope that comes through as we're speaking about it. So the way we operate, we're called Wills and Estates and Succession Planning. A big part of our service is the estate planning. And the way we provide that is in a holistic manner. So we're not there just to fill some names in on a will form, that records your executors and your beneficiaries and that's it, because the experience that we have in the team tells us that doesn't deliver the best outcomes for people. So the way we approach our estate planning from a technical perspective is that we want it to be holistic. So we want to take into consideration, first and foremost, family circumstances. So what's important to our clients? What do they want to see at the end of the day? And then it's up to us strategically to work out how we get there. We take into account assets, financial situation. And again, we're not just asking, what's your pool worth? We're asking, how's it held? We want to know about family trusts. We want to know about whether you've got ideas of starting a business in the next 5 or 10 years, or whether you're going to buy an investment property in the next 5 years, or so that we can start to build that planning in. Because again, those decisions are best made with some advice beforehand, or at the time at least. And we can build that into these long-term estate plans that we do. And we want to think a few steps ahead. So we'd love to have people coming back and reviewing their estate plans every couple of years. We also know that's not a reality for a lot of people. I know that if I think about the last 10 years and how quickly that's gone for me, I'm not surprised that it's often that we're seeing people at 10-year intervals instead of 2 or 3. So we want to build a plan that is both for tomorrow, but also will, at a stretch, cover things in 10 years' time. And we want people to review them in between, but we want it to be robust enough to cover things in 10 years' time. If it has to, then we look at the rest. We want to make sure we cover super at the same time. So we make sure that that's directed in the right way. We consider potential claims against the estate if there's blended family or there's been a relationship breakdown along the way. We'll do completely different planning for people if they've got young kids versus they've got kids heading into their early 20s and 30s. And so we're having a completely different discussion around how we protect them versus if they're minors, and we just really want to get them through that period. Talk about powers of attorney. So really what we want it to be is a holistic process, not just for us, but because we genuinely believe that's what our clients need.
I think it's also what people are demanding now too. I mean, thinking about the way, again, the similarities between the estate planning industry and the financial planning industry, that you can, and for the longest time, been able to get by in that industry by sort of ticking a box and looking surface level and providing people limited advice, but that the ability to actually scratch the surface a little bit and look a little bit deeper, and like you said, holistic, looking at someone's circumstances in a holistic manner, it adds so much value. And value's hard to quantify sometimes. It's very hard to quantify, if we're looking purely in terms of dollar value added. But if I ask clients, and if you were to ask clients what they actually value, they will say, yes, there's some tangible things, there's some practical things, but there's also the value of relationships and having someone that actually understands your situation intimately, but also has great connectivity with the people around you. So that would be, family members, their other professionals, accountants, financial advisors. I think that picture of actually having a holistic view of people's circumstances inherently adds value, because you inevitably pick up things or acknowledge things or direct your advice differently than if you are purely surface level.
Yeah. And we genuinely love working with our clients, the other professionals that our clients lean on for advice. So financial advisors, accountants, because they're the people, one, they have at a minimum kind of an annual contact with clients. They're the ones having that, frontline discussion around a purchase of an investment asset or starting a business, or, they also have a picture of that long-term strategy. Often as a financial advisor, the strategy's not 12 months or 2 years. It's about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the track. And so the planning has to align with that broad plan. The dream is that estate planning is seen as evolving plan and evolving document. It's not something you do once.
Set and forget.
You set and forget, you park, because life changes too quickly. And I think our lives are more complicated than they've ever been. The manner in which we hold assets and change assets and deal with things is more complicated than it's ever been. And so the will that you do once and park away and it's there for 50 years is not going to optimize what we need for our families anymore. It just isn't.
Yeah, and causes great potential risk for things being incorrectly implemented or the wrong people getting assets in the future. I went to a conference yesterday and they had a couple of interesting, this is around investment bonds, but there was a couple of interesting statistics around the sort of estate planning in Australia predominantly, which I thought I'd maybe get your thoughts on. But they were talking about the number of 65 and overs. So obviously people can die of all causes, but predominantly people are dying due to old age or dying close to life expectancy. In Australia, 137,000 people a year will turn 65 and over by 2026. So there's a massive swell of aging population, which is tied to what they said was about a $4.4 trillion wealth transfer that's going to occur over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. So there is a significant amount of wealth that will pass from predominantly baby boomers to their kids or their grandkids. And what's probably scary to me when I think about the clients that we see, no existing clients, but clients that come to us that have significant assets with very shallow or poor, if any, estate plan at all. It's pretty scary.
Yep. And we see the other end, because the other part of the work we do in the team is administering deceased estates and then dealing with estate disputes. So we see the full picture. So it's a really good way of keeping you really aware of what you're doing, because we do often within a career, you see wills that you've prepared or estate plans that you've prepared coming through when your clients have passed away, and you're now needing to administer the estate and see whether what you've actually done works. So it's really important. But with that scenario where we've got this huge amount of wealth being transferred and a lot of clients unfortunately having suboptimal estate planning, best you could hope for is that there'll be some pretty considerable tax consequences that could have been avoided that aren't, which means that you diminish the estate that you've worked hard to build up. But that could be the best you'll hope for. The worst is that the estate ends up tied up in, a dispute that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, takes years to run its course, and in most cases irreparably destroys, or damages the relationships within the family. And I couldn't think of one client I've spoken to who wouldn't want to avoid all three of those potential outcomes.
It's funny, some of the other stats they spoke about, I've got from core data in 2020 was 86% of claims are brought by immediate family.
Mm-hmm.
It's 12 months or more for cases to be heard in court.
Mm-hmm.
88% of seniors plan on leaving an inheritance, 930,000 on average. So there's a significant pool of funds for those people that are sort of the baby boomers and beyond. And this was an interesting one to me, that 36% of estates go to grandchildren, that people are contemplating actually skipping a generation. Why do you think that might be the case? Why are people thinking that they might skip a generation? Is it because they're sort of concerned about maybe partners of their children having dibs on their estate? Or are there any other reasons you could think of why people prefer to sort of skip a generation?
Yeah, I mean, that making sure it's blood, it does absolutely follow bloodline is definitely one of the factors. I think one of the other factors is that we as or that generation are living longer. And so at the time when we're doing estate planning, their own children are often at a stage where they're often independently wealthy already. And so they see that their grandkids who are heading towards maybe their early 20s, they're the ones that need it, and we all know, for all of us, that our 20s and 30s is when you'd benefit most from an inheritance versus your 50s or 60s or even beyond that. So I think that's a major factor. And it's also then becomes and this is a discussion we're having a lot, it's not just about passing on money, it's like a legacy piece. So it's around that, if I leave it to them, that's an indirect way that's removing some burden from my children of having to continue to provide for them. So if the grandchildren are still young, that sort of inheritance will pay for whatever education they want. We'll see them through uni if they want to go to uni. We'll help them start a business. We'll help them start a property portfolio or an investment portfolio. So it it helps them just enter the housing market.
Yeah.
So it indirectly removes that responsibility for their own children, but it also, it means that they're already providing that legacy piece for the next generation.
Yeah. Maybe just we'll probably defer some of the more detailed estate planning for round 2. But one of the other things I thought was interesting, and maybe you can fill the gaps on this, around when someone actually claims or makes a claim on an estate. Maybe let's talk to who can actually challenge an estate first and foremost, and then currently who bears the cost for challenges of estate. I think that'd be interesting to get your perspective on that. Yeah.
So it's one of those frustrating areas. It's different across different states in Australia, but for Victoria, that the group of people who can actually bring a claim has been significantly tightened in the last 10 years, which probably adds to why some of those stats show such a high proportion of claims being brought by close family members.
Yep.
And that's because it's essentially limited to spouses, and that's spouses and just former spouses. Doesn't have to be married. It's children, even adults, but children. It's others who can prove that they're financially dependent on the deceased when they pass away in some capacity, or people who essentially might share a household. But what it's done is it's cut out a lot of the claims by grandchildren who are kind of pretty distant, in terms of relationship, or nieces or nephews. It has removed the ability for, say, siblings to claim, so say they've got a person passes away, they don't have a spouse or children, they've left all their money to charity, that person's siblings, who are going to be at a similar age, previously might have claimed against the estate for some provision. That's kind of carved out a lot of those claims in Victoria. So I've got a smaller pool, and I should say often when we're advising clients around this, there's kind of two stages. There is, the academic, if the court is deciding this is the chances of success or this is the outcome. There's a level below that which we need to be playing in a lot of the time, and that's is somebody going to be essentially enough of a pain and are going to agitate enough that we're going to, even though they might not succeed in a claim, for the sake of saving relationships, for the sake of saving costs and delay and heartache, and that we're going to come to some sort of informal resolution with them.
So is this why, and I think this is older data, it's from 2015, that 74% of estate claims are successful to some degree. Meaning,
Yes.
So, and I think in this statistic, which was, I'll better quote it, UNSW Law Journal, Estate Contestation in Australia, an empirical study of a year in case law, 2015, that 100% of estate claims where the pool of assets was over 3 mil were successful.
Mm-hmm.
So in that instance, you're talking about where some sort of an agreement is reached to give them something.
Yes, something. And so I think that first statistic includes that. I think the second statistic, which was that, 100% over 3 million, is because when there is a bigger estate pool, and so over 3 million would still be considered a bigger estate pool for the, ordinary person, one, people are more encouraged to bring the claim and to progress it further than they would if the estate was, say, $500,000 to $1 million. And the courts, although it's one of the factors in consideration, the court's much more willing to carve up a pool that's $3 million plus than they are to carve up. There's $500,000 and there's a surviving spouse is going to get all of that. If there's $3 million, surviving spouse, might only need $2 million to be kind of comfortable, then there's a potential for them to lose some of that in a claim.
So what are the things practically that people can think about or do in estate planning to potentially reduce? Obviously, the pool of people that can challenge has been reduced, but there's still people can challenge an estate.
Absolutely.
And am I right in saying that if a challenge is brought to an estate, that the estate bears the cost of that, or has that changed as well?
That has changed to a degree. So, and again, it all depends on whether it goes all the way to the court, and a very small proportion of them actually get there where it's being decided by a judge. The vast majority, it's over 90% settle before they get, by an informal negotiation, settle before they get to the steps of the court, is the terminology. So in the first instance, a person bringing a claim, most lawyers are not going to take that on no win, no fee. So there has to be some, in a modern claim, there has to be some funding. So there are some firms which will take on no win, no fee if it's a really good claim, because they know they'll get paid at the end. Query those, and I don't want to say anything out of line, but those firms also tend to push for settlement earlier so that they get paid.
Okay.
So there's a potential sort of conflict of interest in maybe the advice that's being provided, because there is that incentive to get paid, or that need to get paid at some stage, and the sooner the better. But broadly, if we're looking at those ones that actually get to court, if the claim was reasonable, that both parties acted, reasonably in the proceedings, it was reasonable to bring the claim, it was reasonable to try and defend it, generally the estate then wears all of the costs of both parties. If the person brings a claim and they lose, and there are a lot of reasons why, or it's not as successful as it could have been and it's thought to be a bit vexatious, then the court does have the discretion to order the person bringing the claim pays their own costs.
Okay.
So there's always that risk. Or worst case, if either party was completely unreasonable, either party might be ordered to pay the entire costs. So it's possible the estate will have to pay the costs of the claimant. It's also possible that the claimant will have to pay their own costs and maybe a portion of the estate's costs as well. And again, these are all things that we discuss many times along the way, and are often some of the drivers for that informal resolution of the claim. But just keeping in mind, when I say resolution, yes, there might be a final deal and the litigation is done. It's not a resolution for relationships. And so that's often the part that those are irreparably damaged. And so onto that second part of the question, which is what can we do to avoid it? There are a number of things we talk about with all of our clients, whether there is a risk of a claim. We want to find that out, and that's very sensitive to discuss, but it's really important. So, is there a chance? And that might be because there is somebody in their life who they no longer have contact with. It could be that they've separated from somebody, but they haven't finalised their financial settlement, or they haven't finalised their divorce, and so there's still some ties connecting them. That could be because they're actively not including somebody in their will. And so we talk about, a lot of people think, if I give them $1 or I give them some token sum, they can't bring a claim. That's absolutely not true. Sometimes the token sum is actually a red rag to a bullet's worse than giving them nothing. But we talk through that, and we try and work out a little bit about the personality of the person we're worried about. Then there's a whole lot of more legal strategic planning that we can do, which most of that strategic planning is more around minimising the estate asset pool. So what actually is claimable, what can be claimed against. And so that might be trying to move assets into joint names with other parties who you want to benefit, so that it transfers automatically rather than being in that pool that can be claimed against. It might be directing superannuation directly to individuals rather than having that fall into the estate. Or it might be, setting up separate structures like trusts or companies to hold assets, which again, at a technical level, keep it outside of what a person can claim against, at least in Victoria. And a lot of that planning is done much better with a fair bit of lead time. Early, exactly. Yeah. And, particularly if somebody's thinking about investing in something or buying an asset or starting a business, or we can structure things much more easily at that stage than if they already own an asset in a particular way. And then they make the decision that this is really important for me to protect this asset. But what comes with that is, stamp duty and capital gains tax and things on actually moving the asset into the appropriate holding structure that gives the protection.
This is back to the holistic planning around estate planning, that estate planning isn't just drawing that will up. Like you've just said there, that decisions about purchasing assets during your lifetime and where you actually hold your assets and in what entity you hold those assets is actually part of your estate plan. And I think a lot of people, even the idea of, estate versus non-estate assets, I mean, even that simple conversation for people, I think people have misconceptions around what forms their estate. And like having that conversation early, it flows into better planning around your estate planning, better asset and investment planning, and that holistic nature of considering not just a surface level element of people's circumstances, but all aspects. Because once you do start to actually scratch the surface, you realize how interconnected and interrelated people's circumstances are, from their family relationships to their superannuation, to their beneficiary nominations, to where they hold their insurance, to the tax structures that they own. All of those financial planning considerations, their taxation considerations, they might be family law considerations, but they're also estate planning considerations. I think one of the things I'd noted, and I think we spoke about a number of times when we were having coffee, around the sort of the intersection between professionals and just how valuable that is in today's world. Like you spoke about the complexity of people's circumstances, good or bad. Our lives are more complex. And I think what we're seeing is that professionals that are succeeding with delivering service that people want are not protecting their own nest, so to speak. They're actually saying, no, we actually have to work together. We actually have to overlap and integrate and work for the betterment of our clients. And as a result, we add value. And that value is, again, some of it is not as tangible as dollars saved. It can be, but a lot of it is around having relationships that people actually can trust and know that they have a plan that will not only hold them in good stead today, but will actually hold them in good stead for many, many years to come.
And I think that's so true. As professionals, we all have our own area of expertise. We've all got our own. We want to be completely open, but we've all got blinkers on to a degree. I can think of easily 10, 20 examples where, we've thought of a particular strategy for estate planning or to minimise an estate. And then we go and talk to the accountant about it or the financial advisor about it and the sort of issues we're going to create because of the tax planning that they've done for the last 10 years. We have to mould that strategy around those existing structures or whatever they might be. But it's so important. And we could do that if we'd done that estate planning and that succession in isolation, we would have created some real issues. So for clients, the benefit is doing it holistically with a number of, and it doesn't have to be all at once, but a number of those advisors working together to make sure that, we don't mess up the succession, business succession, for instance. That might be another strategy where, we're trying to remove the ownership of a business from, a person's estate pool because somebody has a number of children, but they want to pass on that business interest to one particular child because they've been involved in the business throughout. You've got a couple of options. One is it's within the estate and it only passes on death. The other option is that you might start that succession early and make that transition during your lifetime. But there are a whole lot of other considerations around. Tax is obviously one of the big ones, but then also protecting that, making sure that the person who's passing it on has appropriate capacity so it doesn't get unwound down the track by, an unhappy other sibling. Doing that, if we just transferred shares from one person to another without taking into account the broader environment in which that business has been operating maybe for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to create some real problems. Yeah. So there's real benefit across the board. And I should say, I don't want to scare people off. We don't need this level of estate planning for everybody. And I'll be really clear about that because within our team, this is not the only service we provide, but we want to provide is as much of that spectrum of planning for each of our clients as is required for their own circumstances. Yeah. So if things are simple, that's fine. We'll help you with that. But we'll make sure that within that, you've got at least some education around what you might, if you're 30 and you've just bought your first house and you've got, toddlers, that's your world. But in 10, 15 years, that world's going to look pretty different. So here's some things you can think about at that stage. This is the sort of planning we're going to do in 10 years' time when you're reviewing this. So we're not trying to do that for everybody. We're doing as much of that as is needed for each individual set of circumstances.
Yeah, and educating along the way. I mean,
yes.
that education piece, I think, is huge, where you're right, not everyone has super complex situation. However, you can educate people to the point where they can acknowledge when they've had a significant change of circumstances that would warrant them coming back to you and saying, hey, that situation you mentioned about if I was to purchase a business, that we should talk. They're coming back to you and they're actively saying, hey, let's revise our estate plan based upon that. And even thinking about, as you do progress through more layers of complexity with people's circumstances, I think understanding that, you're right, not in every instance a decision is going to require an accountant, a solicitor, and a financial advisor, but knowing when to actually bring those parties together and also to recognise that it's actually a positive thing if you've got some level of disagreement between your professionals. As long as they've got great relationships, that's exactly what we want. We want them to be picking holes in each other's scenarios. So, again, it's very important. But to your point, I think being able to cater to everyone, whether it be the person that requires some simple estate planning through to that person that has complex needs with blended families and business entities, it's pretty important to know, for people to know that they can take the bits that are relevant for them.
Yes. Yep. And then, like you said, self-identify those, potential issues down the track because of that education process. So, and then it doesn't, whether they come to you or they come to the accountant or they come to us, it doesn't matter. As long as they are able to identify the potential issue before it arises and get the advice, knowing that they've got those advisors working together, somebody will tap the right person on the shoulder where they're required. Yeah,
absolutely. Stefan, we're going to need to do a round 2, mate.
Sounds good.
We could talk for a long, long time on many of these topics, but let's go to how people can connect with you and Coulter Legal on the socials, LinkedIn and the like. How can they find you?
Yeah, so plain and simple, coulterlegal.com.au. That will get you to our website. You can search any of our team. We've got a lot of great content on the website about estate planning and estate administration, estate disputes.
Saw the video on estate planning essentials.
Yes, yeah. We've had some really good feedback on that recently, actually.
Well, I'll make sure I pop that in the show notes too.
Yeah,
so
great.
For those people listening to this and thinking we didn't go deep enough into the estate planning essentials, click on the link below and you'll see Stefan talking through that.
If you want to follow for content that we're sharing, Stefan Manche at LinkedIn, feel free to follow, and any of my colleagues from Coulter Legal. And in the not too distant future, and I hope you don't mind giving it a plug,
No, that's okay.
we're releasing our own Coulter Legal podcast, specifically around estate planning and the ins and outs of it. The working name is Where There's a Will, There's a Way.
I like it.
And we'll be sure to be releasing episodes through the website and LinkedIn. So anyone who's interested in learning more about estate planning, but in this medium as opposed to information sheets or, big chunks of text, we're trying to provide kind of 20, 25-minute bite-sized pieces of useful information for people that they might listen to before starting their estate planning process.
Do you have a release date yet, Stefan?
Hopefully within the next 3 or 4 weeks. So Where are we now? We're end of July. So hopefully in August, they'll start to float out.
Awesome. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this one up?
No, just thank you very much for having me. It's been a really enjoyable discussion. More than happy to do a round two at any stage, but I hope people found something useful from that, and just not to hesitate to get in touch with any of us if need be. If we can
Thanks,
help out.
Stefan. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're keen to understand more about how financial advice could benefit you, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Burke Britain FP, or Google Burke Britain Financial Partners. Check out our client reviews, testimonials, and make a time to meet one of our certified financial planners by clicking Book Now on our website. Thanks for listening.
Any information contained in this podcast is of a general nature only. No account was taken as to the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Therefore, before making any decision, listeners should consider the appropriateness of any information with regard to their particular objective, financial situation, needs, and seek independent advice from a licensed professional specific to their circumstances.
All right, hit it.
That translates to don't be a moron and act on what some random person says on a podcast. Take personal responsibility. Do your homework. Ask questions and speak to an actual human that knows what they're talking about before you do anything. PB Financial Solutions Proprietary Limited, trading as Burke Britain Financial Partners, are authorised representatives of AMP Financial Planning Limited, AFS, licence number 232706.